This is We Bleed Orange and Black, the podcast for Halloween and horror lovers. Join us as we interview creators, discuss our favorite horrors, and share original spooky stories. I'm Jeff C. Carter, and this week we're talking with Jen Gunnels about the magical world of editing. Jen Gunnels is an editor at Tor Publishing Group, where she acquires and develops commercial science fiction, fantasy, and horror, and develops brands across multiple platforms and formats. Her editorial works include the acclaimed novels Semiosis, The Iron Dragon's Mother, and the best-selling epic fantasy series The Saga of Recluse and Chronicle of the Unhewn Throne. Welcome to the show, Jen.
Hi, it's nice to be here.
So I have an icebreaker question for you that was not included in the list.
Oh no.
What is your favorite sword?
The one that I have in my living room.
Okay, can you be more specific?
I have two in my living room. One is this really lovely combat-ready swept hilt rapier. And the other is kind of like a cross between a scimitar and a cavalry sword. It's used for belly dancing.
So it's well balanced?
Yeah, you balance it on your head and, do fancy stuff.
Very cool. I can see why you keep that one at the ready.
Like, here it is. And I have Psy hanging next to my bed because it's New York City. You never know when you need those.
In case you need to block a sword and deflect at the same time.
Exactly.
Okay, follow-up question. Which Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle were you?
Oh my God. Okay, so funny thing. I had an ex-Army Ranger who lived in the apartment above mine. Really nice guy. We were pretty decent friends, acquaintances. And he came down one day and he saw some of my karate stuff and the swords. And he asked me specifically, you're like all the Ninja Turtles at the same time, right?
Would that make you Splinter?
Yeah, kind of.
You had mentioned that you had a very unorthodox path into editing.
People are always asking me, how did you get into editing? I got here almost by accident. I come out of theater. I've been a director and a dramaturg. My degrees are all in theater, except for like my undergraduate.
With your theater background, obviously you've been immersed in literature for a very long time. What is the crossover between traditional theater and then this, I don't know if I want to say avant-garde or niche sci-fi horror theater?
Oh my gosh. Funny thing, Nat Cassidy is one of my authors, as you well know. I knew Nat before I became an editor and he became an author. Like we were familiar with each other because he was doing playwriting and stage work and I was a theater critic. So we got to know each other that direction before he ever started doing books. There's not much of a crossover. I mean, avant-garde is doing strange things. Science fiction, horror, and fantasy on the stage does strange things. It's more of how much do you experiment and how much can you transfer some of the tropes to the stage. Horror is very hard. Nat does it really well, but horror is hard to do that because there's kind of a tacit understanding that nothing horrible is going to happen to you. So it makes horror a little bit more difficult to do on the stage. Science fiction can be done, but it needs to be very character driven, very intimate, and it has to be mostly about ideas as opposed to here's a cool ray gun, pew, pew, pew. So everything has to boil down to, in both instances, an intimacy with the characters and the issues that they're going to wrestle with. And one does that within a framework of science fiction or horror, but it follows the same procedures that regular theater has to follow no matter what.
And as an editor who covers the sci-fi horror beat with this theater background, are you always dialing in on characters, or is there a setting that you could buy into and then apply your theater background to helping someone develop the characters?
Yeah, I do that a lot. There's a lot of crossover between being an editor and being a dramaturg in the theater where you're working on new plays and stuff. I think the thing that I zero in on a lot is an intimacy with the characters and well-written dialogue. I would rather see worlds fleshed out and details fleshed out in conversation as opposed to extended informational dumps in paragraphs. I mean, obviously that has to happen in certain instances, but one of the things that I always loved about the theater is the ability of the characters, especially in experimental and black box, to flesh out everything we need to know without having to say, as you know, Bob.
Through dialogue and through character interaction.
A lot of times when people ask me, what are you looking for, Jen? I love books where when I'm reading it, I feel like I'm watching a film or a play.
Mm.
I want to have that kind of, I'm not just reading it, I'm in it. That's really what I'm looking for. And part of being in it is having it peopled with these characters that I either want to slap or go to drinks with, or both.
I know that people with a film background often encounter criticism that their novels don't have enough interiority to the characters. It's all very external, very plot driven. It may rely more on setting, and vice versa. Sometimes I will watch a movie and I'm like, was this a stage play? Because it's not very dynamic. There's not a lot of locations. It doesn't move. It feels kind of flat and stale. Something that might be compelling when you're in the room and the actors are sweating on you is just not the same when you're watching it through a screen. When you adapt a theater piece to a novel, is that also its own bubble?
I've worked both directions. And the way I like to explain it is certain kinds of art are more or less porous than other kinds of art. So when you come at the theater and film, the screenwriter, the playwright are expecting that these characters are going to be internalized and put into bodies that are going to interpret and put the physicality out there in a number of ways that are not necessarily anticipated. You've got a cinematographer, you've got a set designer, you've got a lighting designer. And books don't have that. Books are about as non-porous as you can get, because nobody is going to do the cinematography for the book, and vice versa. If you're going from a person who wrote novels, you're used to putting everything very solidly on the page for the reader. If you put it on stage or in a film, doesn't give the space, the porousness for the other creatives involved in making that medium to come forward and do their magic. You can't tell the actor necessarily how to act. Like, let the actor do their job, let the set designer do their job, let the costume designer do their job. You can suggest, but I mean, when I was directing plays, the first thing anybody does, and it's Nat and I laugh about this, the first thing you do is you take a black Sharpie and you cross out every single stage direction. Like, I don't need to know this. So yeah, it's best to think of it as mediums that are more or less porous. Novels are absolutely not porous. They are obsidian. Then you get into the more porous, like, pumice stones as you go to the other end of mediums that involve more visual, actual bodies coming forward and doing the things for you. And that's the big thing that people have a difficulty crossing back and forth between mediums tend to have. Nat does not suffer from that.
Nat is a volcano that produces all kinds of metamorphic rock in this analogy.
Most of the time I have to tell him, it's like, that's awesome that you know that. It's awesome that I know that now. The readers don't need to know this. Take it out of the book.
Less is more. So I feel like we jump right into the nitty gritty of adaptation and punching up a manuscript. Could we take a brief backstep and just get a high level view of editing? Because it's not just sitting down with the manuscript. You are in the process before you've even acquired the books. So
yes,
what would that look like on a typical project? Or is every project different?
Yes, every project is in fact different, but the process doesn't change. I will get oodles and oodles and oodles of submissions, like oodles, so many oodles with lots of capital O's.
Metric oodles?
I read those. I choose based on what I think readers are going to want, sometimes 2 or 3 years from now. I'm attempting to, like a venture capitalist, predict what the market's going to want. Sometimes I am right. Sometimes I am grossly incorrect, but that's what we're ultimately aiming for. And once I have a manuscript that I really, really like, that I've fallen in love with, and that, like, I can imagine everything, I will put together an acquisition packet that goes to a group of people that say yes or no to the project. And then I go back to the agent and I say, hey, I want to buy your book. And there's negotiation back and forth on a contract. And this is different in every instance because we have boilerplate, they have boilerplate, and these can involve very, very different types of things depending upon the book and or the author. And then once I have that, we start the process of editing the book. And that is one of several different parallel processes that start as soon as the contract ink is dry.
Mm.
So not only will I be editing the book, sending that back for revisions, reading the revisions, I also, as far as that text is concerned, that needs to be formatted for advanced bound manuscripts that we send out for quotes. And then those eventually go to production, and production does the copy editing and the typesetting and the interior design and the proofreading. And at a certain stage, one of those passes ends up becoming the advanced review copy. And that goes to various media outlets and other important people to give us even more quotes and buzz. While all that's going on, I am also coming up with the cover concept and writing up the cover concept and working with the art designer to produce the really cool slick covers that you see. I also have to write the copy for the book. So all the words, any words on that book came out of an editor. So the cover copy, we go out looking for quotes. We solicit the information from the author in terms of their photo and the bio, and that all goes in there. We are also the main point of contact for the author between the author and the marketing and publicity team. We're sort of directors, we're the linchpins. We are both a facilitator and team leader. And in addition to that, we're also kind of a firewall. So if there's any sort of weird things going on or somebody needs to be talked off a ledge, we're the person in the middle along with the agent, making sure that everybody's getting as much of what they want as possible and keeping everything smooth and diplomatic and fun. Because honestly, if you're not having fun when you're making a book, I mean, this should be fun. We're making art.
What would be an instance of a prognostication that bore out?
3 or 4 years ago, I would not have thought that cozy science fiction or cozy fantasy was going to be the hot thing. That wasn't really on my radar at that point in time. And stuff started coming in. And in a way, you notice these things kind of coming into your inbox. And it's not like everybody's talking to each other. And it's not like these things are already published. But you kind of notice a sort of movement toward a kind of thing. 3 or 4 years ago, you had just a few little bits and bobs of things that could be considered quote unquote cozy, whatever the genre is. And now that's really, really big. God, when I first started, when I was a baby editor, dark academia was not a thing. And now it's really, really big. So it's things like that. You're trying to look for, what's the arc that gets you to that thing. And sometimes it's just what's in your inbox. And you kind of figure, oh, well, since I have so many of X, this must be a thing. I wonder. When you see what other people are publishing and you see what other people are reading. And I mean, I read outside of our own imprint and various other things. And I see stuff and I think, oh, wow, this is really cool. I wish I was the person who had edited this. This is awesome. And so you think, oh, if I liked this, maybe other people will like this. And you go looking for that thing.
Because you are sifting through the oodles of submissions, you get an overview of the zeitgeist, the conversation that's going on in books as people consume media, or maybe perhaps consume too much of a certain genre. You see what gets tired, and then what are some fresh things that float up to the top.
Exactly.
It's so interesting. You are aggregating from dozens, hundreds, thousands of books that are in their larval stage. It must be weird to try to find the pulse of media.
It's both weird and terrifying at the same time because you're like, oh my God, I really want to be right. Yeah, it is kind of weird. Sometimes you see stuff and you're like, oh God, it's this again. And sometimes you'll start and say, oh God, it's this again. And as you read, they take that trope that was so tired and an author can flip it upside down or turn it inside out and do something really innovative and unexpected. And you're like, ooh, that's really awesome. And you want to look for things like that too.
So when you happen upon a submission that piques your curiosity, how close is it to what you have your sights on? Would you try to acquire something that was just in the broadest sweep, like cozy, and then try to bring it along? Or do you want to make sure the story is solid and it meets one of these moving targets? Just trying to time the market years out.
First and foremost, I am looking for an author who is a solid writer. I'm looking for somebody who has a very firm sense of where they are in the genre and style, because I am not here as an editor to teach somebody how to write. That's over in a different area. I'm looking for people who I know are going to be able to take direction, for lack of a better word. That direction might be greater. I have some authors turn in stuff to me that's almost clean and there's not a lot to do. I've had other people where I've bled all over the document and we've had to do like major overhauls where, no, you have 6 characters too many. All of this has to go. So the answer is yes, I'm there to shape to greater and lesser extents, but my concern is, can this person write? Second question is, can this person take direction? Because I have run into people who are just, well, I don't need an editor. I'm like, okay, fine. I'm not sure why you're coming to me then, because I'm going to edit the book. So that's my primary concern is I really want to make sure that this is good writing. Can they take direction and move the book where I think it needs to be? Do they have a compelling hook? Do they have some compelling characters? Because you might have a compelling hook, but maybe your pace is really bad, or maybe your characters aren't as compelling as your hook is. So there are a lot of moving parts that have to be considered as part of this sort of organic equation that moves in one direction one time and maybe in a different direction another. You just get used to, like in theater, everything is live, so nothing's the same way twice.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same thing when you're picking up a book out of your submission pile. None of this is going to be the same thing twice. None of my authors are like, the process is, but every single one of them takes a very different kind of editing. They all have wildly different creative processes. And at no point in time do I ever ask anybody to change a creative process. I'm like, don't fix what isn't broken. And I adjust myself to work within that framework so that they can get the most out of what I can help them with.
So a point of contrast I see is in screenplays. I know a lot of screenwriters and they have all these nightmare stories where someone will say that they're interested in the script and then they literally want a page 1 rewrite.
You can do things like a revise and resubmit, but that's very, very seldom.
Mm-hmm.
And that's more kind of can the person do what I want them to do? Because there's a question about that. Sometimes we'll get a manuscript that we might have rejected in the past and we don't like resubmitting things, but maybe the author will take that and completely rework it over the course of 1, 2, 3 years. By that time, it is a completely different thing. And usually the agent's super upfront with, hey, you saw this before, but they've been working on it for the last X amount of months, years, whatever. And they've really changed a bunch of stuff. Would you be interested in looking at it again? Like they always ask, they always tell us up front, which I always really appreciate. Like, that's great. But that's really, really seldom.
And the onus is on the writer,
Yeah.
and the relationship is the open door, as opposed to keeping them on the hook. Like, no,
Right.
we want this, just start over.
Right. I've expressed interests before, and then maybe I get turned down in committee, which happens. I'm not the one that makes the final decisions on these things. It is, in fact, a committee decision. That's also to keep everybody honest. I mean, I think that's a necessary part of the process, because your love of the thing can blind you to the fact that you didn't consider X, Y, and Z. And that's why we have the checks and balances. So it keeps everything very honest and very real, which I definitely appreciate as part of the process. And then you get to hear other people's hot takes in there as well. And there have been times I've been like, oh man, I didn't consider that. You're totally right. So like I said, it's this very organic process. It's not a done thing from point A to point B. Like sometimes you take weird little diversions, but I don't like keeping people on the hook. If an author has been brave enough to hand it to his or her agent and then send it to me, I need to respect the courage that it took to hand it to somebody like me. And the day I don't respect that is the day that I really need to consider a different line of work.
You had mentioned that amongst these many parallel tracks, there's also cover design.
Oh, yeah.
I would have thought that would get handed out to a different department. So I'm surprised that you're thinking about imagery and branding and all these things. I guess as the first contact with the manuscript, you know what the tone is and what the big standout images are.
Yeah.
Can you talk us through that process a little bit?
Let's use NESTLINGS as an example. read through Nestlings. Nestlings wasn't the original title, but it was nest of some sort. He talks about know when you're home and being home, and the baby in that is the nickname is Baby Bird. And so there are all this imagery, but I'm still dealing with a horror novel. I have been known to do random internet surfing just like anybody else. And I'll come across images, and for some reason, my brain becomes an image Rolodex. Like I remember what I see. And I remembered these images of Lake Nacron in Africa, which is the most alkaline lake. And they are birds and animals that have essentially been calcified. They've died sitting there. And so that was the inspiration for the cover, was a photo that I saw of this very real calcified bird. And I'm like, this is the cover for Nestlings, is this calcified dead bird in a nest. And then we put the New York skyline in the back in a funky color, because funky color, it's a horror novel and it takes place in New York City. Sometimes I'll have things where I'm like, that's very specific, and others I will have a more general idea, and I'll come up with these images and say, the book reminds me of this. This is why this image gets the association with me. And I'll have like 3 or 4 of those. And I'll talk about, I'm thinking about this sort of direction, because I also need to give the cover artist and our cover designer the room in which to work. So if you get too hyper specific, that can kind of screw you over. If it's too general, then it's not enough guidance information for the artist, who sometimes has not read the book, sometimes they do. You have to find that sweet spot where it's just enough information to provide a solid framework for the art, but not so much that the artist no longer has any kind of creative room to move.
It's a question of how porous it is.
Exactly.
Osmosis for the win. Can you tell me a bit about the cover of Nat's book, Mary?
Oh, God. I saw that. Like, I've loved working with Nat on his books because inevitably they hit home for me too. And this is a book about the horror of menopause, and I was going through menopause at the time. So I was like, woohoo, I have so much to say about this, Nat. And with the content of Mary, no spoilers, it really put me in mind of self-care, almost a parody of self-care, where if you put yourself in the bathtub with your journal and some candlelight and a bottle of wine, everything will be absolutely great. No, it's a woman in a bathtub with a pillowcase, which is key to the serial killer in there. And as a nod to what's happening in the character, there's this hand coming out and gripping the character's hand, and it's not hers. Originally, we'd gone really, really buck wild with this thing. And we had like 6 different hands coming out of the bathtub. But people like were deeply disturbed and heavily freaked out about that. So we were told that we needed to cut it down to 1 hand, much to our disappointment.
This is secretly an undercover Nat Cassidy fan cast.
I love working with him. He is an absolute dream. And again, what's kind of fun is because we've known each other from theater, and we're used to working in the theater, we have these really wild shortcut kind of conversations that use a lot of theatrical shorthand. And we tend to be on the same page for the most part. So it's really, really fun to work with him on stuff. He's really, really great at taking editorial direction and flipping it and saying, what about this? And what about this? He's not afraid to experiment. I really love the fact that whenever he's doing a book, and he does tend to write about women, interestingly enough, he really does the homework to get it right. And I think that that is very much a product of him being a playwright as well as a screenwriter, and understanding any character he writes is going to have to be authentically inhabited by a body. And that's baked in. So when he's writing these female characters, he's doing the research because he automatically comes from a place where somebody might have to be this person.
Mm-hmm.
And I need to be very, very honest about it, because anything less, I should get called on. He asks me things. I mean, there are things in Mary that when he's talking about menopause, I've said, Nat, honey, that's not what happens. And he listens. He's like, oh, okay, your physical experience of this portion of life is absolutely 100% more valid than my male one. And it was the same thing with nestlings and postpartum, because I knew I was going to have postpartum. So it was very much under control, but it also allowed me to give him some insights into the thought process of like, what's going on in your head directly after having a child. And so I was able to give him some of that. And so some of my comments from the margins are actually in the book at this point. He just did this cut and paste and just said, it's like, fine, that's going in there. I love the way it sounds. I love the energy that he brings to literally everything that the two of us do with his books.
So it sounds like the relationship between a writer and an editor can be very personal, especially if you are offering up some of these lived experiences.
I think some of the best relationships I've had with authors have been when they are very, very personal. It just makes it easier to do the job. I think it makes it easier for the author to feel like they're genuinely getting heard and to feel like, okay, you get it. So I'm willing to listen to the things that you have to tell me. It ends up being much more of a creative process. I write essays. I wrote a lot of academic stuff. I couldn't write fiction to save my soul. I don't want to. And it's just a better idea for me to not do that. But I am a really good narratological grease monkey. I can get up into the books and its mechanics and tell you whether or not spark plugs need to get gapped or, your transmission shot. And to me, that's my job, is to get in there and to make it purr. You bring me a Kia and I want to send you out the door with a Bugatti.
Bugatti's made here. That should be on your business card.
Yes, there you go.
You work for a few separate imprints at Tor. Each has their own bailiwick, their target audience.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what makes an imprint or a brand?
I can't speak to the way any other publisher does it. I can only speak to what Tor Publishing Group does. And Tor Publishing Group is an amalgam of many different imprints. Shorthand is each one does its own genre. So like Bramble is our romance imprint. They do romance, romantasy. Forge is more women's fiction, westerns, thrillers, mysteries, things of that ilk. Tor, fantasy and science fiction. Nightfire, horror. Whatever horror, like science fiction horror, dark fantasy, if it leans more horror. Tor.com is shorter fiction. So it's science fiction and fantasy, but novellas. So not full-length novels, just novellas. Reactor, which is kind of a part of us, does short stories online. And then we have a middle grade imprint called Starscape. And we also have a YA imprint called Teen. So when I get something in, I do more along the lines of science fiction, fantasy, horror. Depending on the length, I'm primarily looking at Nightfire, Tor. I haven't done very many novellas, so like to a lesser extent Tor.com, but if I got a novella, I would certainly consider it for that. And so you kind of decide what kind of a thing do you have? I've had science fiction stuff that skews more horror. And so I have conversations with the upper level editors and kind of guide the imprint and say, like, what do you think? Do you think this skews more horror? Do we want to edit it that direction? Or would it be better keeping it over here at Tor and just calling it like dark fantasy or, lighten it up and make it more science fiction? So we think about where these things are best positioned. And I think the one thing that I would love for people to walk away with on this podcast is editors are not the bad people. Like there is no percentage in me to screw over an author or have their book do bad. Like there's 0% for that.
Okay, I'll change the title of the episode.
I really want their baby that they've handed me to be the best baby ever and to bitch slap the Times and say, look, it's a bestseller. Here, take the baby. That doesn't happen that way. But I mean, it really is to think about how to best position and create and mold this book so that it can have the most success possible. Bottom line.
the idea of positioning a project and teasing out or sweetening a bit of the sci-fi or bolstering the horror is interesting to me because you know better than the writer how many slots there are in a given slate, what your release schedule is. Is Tor.com doing something that's maybe too similar in that vein and you want to differentiate? Do you just gain that perspective from sitting a lot of meetings with the higher level editors? And is there an overarching strategy? So when you're combing through your submissions, you're like, okay, I think if we just nudge this a little darker, I can find a home for this under Nightfire.
You want to have as much of that as possible upfront. Even before the acquisition, you want to have all of that in your back pocket, what you're going to do with that. And that is going and talking to other editors, talking to people who have a specific facility with the thing that you're doing. Also factored into that is just experience, sitting in a lot of meetings, listening to a lot of people, your own reading. Publishing is a thing where it's really more of an apprentice system. And you learn a lot as you go along from different editors as you go along. My favorite thing to do when I was coming up was to go to various departments, whether that was contracts or production, and sit down and say, hey, I don't even know enough about this to ask you a good question. What are the top 5 things you wish an editor knew in order to do better work with you in your department? And that's been really, really great. And I've learned a lot from just going to other divisions and talking to them about, production and interior design and these various things. Art, I talk to all the time. Like, I'd love to do this thing. Is this artistically impossible to do the thing? Or, is there a way to do this? Because they know I don't necessarily every single time. And so you get to have a feel for that the longer you do the thing.
Were you with Tor when they were still at the Flatiron building?
Yes.
Are you sad that you guys moved?
I am. I like that neighborhood so much better.
I was sad when I found out you'd moved.
We're down here in the Wall Street, basically FiDi, and just so much no. I will say, though, that I love the fact that we are almost directly opposite Trinity Church.
Okay.
It's a beautiful old church, and there's a gorgeous old cemetery. Alexander Hamilton is there. I love taking afternoon walks after lunch through there because they have it done really, really nice. They have these beautiful benches and it's landscaped gorgeously and these really super old, creepy looking tombstones. I'll take my computer with me because I can get Wi-Fi. And I'll sit and I'll edit in the cemetery.
That sounds glorious.
It's nice.
Yeah.
It's very pleasant. In the summer, it's just really nice. And weirdly, once you get inside the gates, it's not particularly noisy. So that's kind of nice too.
All right. Hot tip for the editors listening.
Hot tip.
What trends do you see in genre and format?
Ebook's not going to go anywhere. Audio is not going to go anywhere. Definitely trade paper's not going to go anywhere. Mass market, people just aren't buying mass markets very much anymore. So I think the cute little thing that you find at grocery stores that you and I probably grew up with, you're not going to find those tiny little pocket editions. I mean, there are still ways to do pocket editions, but those would be like special things. Yeah, mass market just in general, and this is industry-wide, publishing industry. If you read Publishers Weekly and you look at mass markets, they're on a nearly irrevocable downturn.
Are they becoming the vinyl of formats?
Yeah, they really are becoming the vinyl formats. You're still going to see them in Amazon from other dealers. You're going to see them on used bookstores and the rest of it. So it's not like they're going to magically disappear. We're just not really going to be making very many more of them. The big 5 just are simply not doing these to the extent that they used to.
It does seem to be an area where small presses are able to expand their offerings in terms of chapbooks and novelettes and things. So this is more for the readers than the writers because the rule of thumb is never try to write to the market because it's always changing. But what trends do you currently see in the horror genre?
I see, thankfully, a bit more indigenous work up and coming, which I am hungry for. I want to see more of that. I think it's incredibly interesting, and I'm glad it's starting to get some traction. I love the fact that we're doing more LGBTQ plus you're getting more social horror. Nat writes a lot of social horror. I'm waiting to see if anybody does more climate horror, which to me is sort of a subset or adjacent to folk horror. I mean, to me, that's like a nice little intersection. I haven't seen as much, but we're burgeoning on it.
Follow-up question. What would you like to see more of?
Well, like I said, I would love to see some more Indigenous horror. And by Indigenous horror, not just First Nation horror, not just North American Indigenous. I would love to see something like, I'm sure that there's for the Japanese, the Ainu people, I'm sure the Sami over in Northern Europe have a horror tradition somewhere in there. I would love to see some more culturally diverse horror. I'd like to see some more Japanese. I'd like to see some more Korean. I'd love to see some more Chinese. I would love to see some Indian horror, Indian subcontinent. Like, what have you guys got? What do you have going on in Africa? So I just, I want to try and break out of that traditional Western mold and really kind of bring a lot of voices into horror, because I think they're out there, and I think they're bringing some things that we've never seen before, which is great. I want them to send me stuff that messes me up and makes me not want to sleep. I think that horror is such a wonderful, wide, disturbing topic. And there are so many different avenues into it. What's really, really great is in 100 years, I never thought that I would be editing horror novels, because when I was a kid, I couldn't watch horror and I couldn't read horror because I was one of those, my imagination was a bit too good. And so if I accidentally saw something really upsetting or disturbing, it did not leave my head.
It went into that visual Rolodex of yours?
It went into the visual Rolodex and would not let me go. And as a child, like, you don't have any ways of doing it. And so I kind of came out thinking, oh, I don't like horror. It's too icky for me. It's too scary. And as I've gotten older, I've, kind of started dipping a toe and sort of sidling up to the horror genre and like maybe licking its ear and seeing what it does. And I'm really finding myself, now that I've got a toe in the water, really wanting to wade in and see what's going on. I'm hardly an aficionado. I am hardly a person who is deeply steeped in stuff. And I'm extremely interested and respectful of the people who are, because I'm just like, you're made of sterner stuff than I was when I was a kid. But I'm finding that I really love it. And as I've gotten older, there are elements that really speak to me at this point. And that's been really, really interesting to get involved in.
In my experience interviewing creators, it's the ones who felt the fear that are the best at channeling and exploring horror. The people that are super jaded and nothing scares them, it's like being a chef without taste buds. I'm not interested. Not interested in anything you have to make.
And I will say, I went to StokerCon, which is where we met, in a bar, as is appropriate at a con. And that was the first horror convention that I'd ever gone to. And I've been to a lot of conventions, a lot of different kinds. And I was absolutely floored and really appreciative of how very inclusive and excited everybody is in the horror community. It's just such a great community. And, I'm sitting there like, what are you doing? It's like, I'm a complete noob. And you're just embraced. And it's just like, awesome. There's no gatekeeping. They're like, you're a noob. Awesome. You're going to like X, Y, and Z. And they just throw these things at you. And if you don't like that, or that doesn't interest you, they've got like 50 other suggestions for you. And there's no judgment and just nothing but beautiful, raw enthusiasm. And I was just like, wow, I love this energy. This is great.
It was a good energy there for sure. Good vibes all around.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Which people outside the genre may not expect at a horror convention, that the vibes would be so good.
Yeah, I mean, I was just like, it was absolutely great. And the panels were very well attended, and people are asking really good questions, some of which are really hard, but they're done with a level of respect and humor. And just, I really, really liked it from start to finish. It was a great, great vibe. Love it. Want to do it again next year, 100%.
Awesome. I'll see you there. So going in the other direction, what advice would you have for a writer just starting out?
Experiment. have a thick enough skin to know that you're going to get a lot of rejections. It's the same thing I would tell to somebody going into acting. Like, you need to have an ego. It needs to not be like dick energy, so to speak, but it's going to take a lot of knocks. You're going to have a lot of people say no. And you need to be able to take that and not necessarily be discouraged. You also, I think, need to get out there, get a writer's group, have a group of people discuss each other's writing. You learn by doing and you learn from other people. But when you have that writer's group, they're really looking at it with a writer's eyes. And I think that that is a very useful and helpful learning process to build your style and to build your ability and hone your skill. The other thing that I would suggest is don't necessarily write to the market. You could, but that has a tendency to produce really flat work. Know the market, look at it and go, oh, hey, there seems to be a lot of stuff here, but I don't see X. Maybe there's a reason you don't see X because nobody wants it, but maybe that's because nobody knows that there's something interesting there.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you're the person to bring that interest, like Indigenous horror, and to just write. Always be doing the next thing. Like, yeah, this is out and my writing group is reading it. Don't just sit on your butt, write the next story. Experiment with lengths, try something short, try something medium, try something long. Just really dig in and practice it the same way you would practice art or football or hockey or anything else. You don't get good by, sitting there and watching it. You get good by watching other people who are better than you, watching people who are worse than you, looking and seeing what other people are doing it yourself. So, I mean, just get in there and get your hands dirty. If you didn't get dirty, you didn't do nothing.
And as a corollary, what advice would you have for someone who has only self-published?
I don't think there's anything wrong with self-publishing. I often am looking to see if there are people who have self-published that have something interesting and see like, hey, would you like to try traditional publishing? Rule number one in any good situation, the money flows to the author, period, full stop. If somebody's saying, give me money and I can do this, the answer is no, absolutely not. Avail yourself of Writer Beware, which is a great online free resource. But yeah, I mean, if you want to do self-publishing, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's a great way to get your feet wet. Just make sure that you're going with someone who's reputable. If you are looking for an agent, I get a lot of people who ask me, who should I get for an agent? I'm an editor. I am ethically bound to not have favorites. So I'm not going to tell you how to do that. But I will say, go out and find the books that look like the thing you're making and look in the acknowledgments, because people often give their agent a nod. Now, is that agent accepting submissions? Maybe, maybe not, but you can go look them up and see if they are. And occasionally their inbox is open for new submissions. You can put that on your calendar to do that. But that's really the best way to get a feel, is go and look at the acknowledgments and see who's doing what for whom.
This was incredibly informative, as I knew it would be. Where can our listeners find you online?
I am over on LinkedIn. I'm findable. If you just put Jen Gunnels in there, people will find me.
I've heard a rumor that you're often skulking about in the cemetery finance district.
That's right. You can always see me furtively scuttling around with a computer under my arm, hunched over, mad eyes glistening in the twilight, dressed in black. Yeah, that would be me. Computer in one hand and a bottle of scotch in the other.
A proper editor. This was amazing. Thank you for chatting with us.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. This has been really, really great. And I wish everyone good luck if you're writing. Find some good books if you're reading. Recommend them to your friends and go make some book clubs and some new friends via horror. I'm now in it with you and I love it.
Please subscribe and follow. Links are in the show notes. You can find me at jeffccarter.com and hit the link to pick up my collection, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 fun-sized tales for Halloween. Until next time, stay spooktacular.